In this video I'm going to show you how to debug Symfony commands on a console. I'm starting with a clean PHP 8.03 without anything installed. Let's show what I have. A plain PHP 8.03 with Xend opcache enabled. The first step to enable debugging is to install Xdebug. I'm on a Linux system with all the relevant compiler tools installed, which means I can install Xdebug by running PECL. Depending on your setup, the PECL tool can already add Xdebug to your PHP ini file. In my situation it hasn't done this and I'll have to do this myself. It handily tells me exactly what to add. I'll copy this line. In order to find out which file to add this line to, I'll run php-ini. This shows all the ini files that PHP has loaded. In this case it is only libphp.ini. I will open it up to add my Xdebug line. In my existing ini file I already have Xend extension equals opcache. It is important that opcache is loaded before Xdebug. Therefore I will add the line that PECL told me below the Xend extension line. The line that PECL gave me is the full path to the extension, which is something that will certainly work. However, with PHP 8, providing that PHP is set up correctly, we can shorten that to just the following. You don't even have to use the .so anymore either. I will now save this and show that Xdebug is now loaded. As you can see, Xend opcache shows up first and Xdebug second. If it would show the other way around like here, with Xdebug first and Xend opcache second, you need to find out in which ini files Xdebug gets loaded, so to make sure that it gets loaded after Xend opcache. To find out which files are loaded, you can again use php-ini. Again, I only have libphp.ini configured, so this is the file to update. It is important to realize that by default the PECL tool will always add the line to the top of the file. So if PECL would have added Xdebug to your ini file, it will most certainly be wrong. Again, as I said, move it to below opcache. After you have installed Xdebug and verified that it is loaded with php-v, we now need to configure Xdebug's mode. This is a new feature in Xdebug.3 which allows you to enable certain features of Xdebug without other features that you are not using at that moment impacting performance. The setting to use is xdebug.mode, which I will set to debug. It is, however, also common that in debug mode you also still have the development tools enabled, so in many cases I will use debug, develop. I would recommend that being your default setting when you're doing debugging. You can verify which modes are enabled with Xdebug by using a new feature of Xdebug 3 called xdebug_info. I will run that as a function on the command line. Running Xdebug info shows you a whole wealth of information about how Xdebug is set up and what it has tried. For now we are just making sure that our development aids and the step debugger are enabled, which you can see by the tick mark and the word enabled. The next step is to put the IDE in listening mode. Because we are debugging from the command line, we do not have to take care of any sort of complicated setup with web servers. In my case, I go to Run and then click Start Listening for PHP debug connections. Because this is the first time I'm debugging anything, I will also enable the break at first line in PHP script. The screen also already shows you the Symfony command that I'm going to want to debug. In order to immediately stop at the right location, I will put a breakpoint in my execute function so that we can see what happens. To set a breakpoint, you can click the margin and a red dot appears. We now need to go back to the command line. Normally you run the Symfony command as follows. And we get our output. Of course we want to debug this. In order to instruct Xdebug to debug this, we can prefix our command with an environment variable. The value at the moment is not important. Let me run this and it now should open up in the IDE. Nothing happens, which is usually a good sign. PhpStorm has stopped on the first line in my code, just like I expected. If you switch to the Debugger tab, you can see the current state of the application. Of course, we did not really want to stop at this line, we wanted to stop our own breakpoint. So now we can click Continue or Resume Program or F9 to do that. The second time it stops is indeed at the breakpoint that we have set for our command line function. And we can now inspect what is in our arguments. For example, our input interface, our input variable, is listed below here as variables. You can see the tokens, what is parsed, the definition, the arguments. And I'm interested in the arguments because I'd like to see what was the value that was passed on the command line. The arguments in this case are the command, which is the name of my command here, as well as the number 7, which is what I added as argument to this command. In any case, let's step through this to see how the factorial number is being calculated. You can use this button, Step Over or F8, to step over lines to the next line in the same file, which I will also do for the right line because I don't really want to debug Symfony itself. Now I am interested in how the factorial number is calculated, so for that I will use the Step Into button or F7, which will dive into the next line of code that is being executed no matter where it is. This now stops in the calculate factorial function where we can analyze what happens. But there's a better way of doing that by just right clicking and then selecting Run to Cursor. We can now see that our factorial number is 5040. You can actually change this number by selecting factorial in the variables tab and selecting Set Value or F2. And we can now simply give it a different number. Now we're done debugging what we have here. We can click Continue again or Resume Program or F9 to run to the end of the application. On our console we now get the number that we have manipulated. Because we've had one successful debugging session, I will also temporarily disable this breakpoint. In order to temporarily disable a breakpoint, you can right click on the dot and unselect Enabled. When we run our command again, the ID won't stop again. Currently our function accepts an integer and returns an integer, but factorials can get big really quickly, so let's see what happens if we use a number that gets out of the integer range quickly. In my example I'm using 30. Now Symfony returns an error because PHP throws a uncaught error because our number is out of line. It no longer returned an integer but instead it returned a float. With Xdebug it is possible to set a breakpoint on exceptions, so let's do that right now. You can't click this, but you can go to View Breakpoints here. And we add a new breakpoint, which is a PHP exception breakpoint, and we'll use the exception name star, which is a wildcard for all exceptions. Now let me run the command again. The execution stops because the IDE has intercepted it. The debugger stops at a specific line. It stops at throw new runtime exception with a message. And if we look at in which function this is, we see that it is a parse argument function. I do not understand why Symfony threw an exception here, because it shows the message no arguments expected for app calc factorial command, but got 30, which is incorrect because of course our code definitely expected this number. Let me just resume the program and see what happens next. It now stops again on the exception type error, which if we click view we can see in full, although it is a bit small. It says the return value must be of type int but a float was returned, which is the one that we were expecting originally. We can also see the whole stack on how we ended up at this situation. And of course, if we inspect the factorial number itself, we can see this is a floating point number, which of course doesn't match an integer. I hope that in this short video you have seen how we can set up Xdebug to debug Symfony console commands with PhpStorm. Thank you for listening and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.